Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be sharing and discussing supporting neurodivergent learners at reducing barriers for success. I'm just going to get started. To kind of guide me, I do use video PowerPoint, but there are going to be a number of times we just shut it off so that we can better talk and things like that. So, what is neurodivergence? Neurodivergence is an umbrella of different kinds of processing differences, different ways that people's brains work differently than average. Now, what we have showing on the screen is the neurodivergent umbrella covering a range of 25, 30 different differences, cognitive processing differences that are under the neurodivergent umbrella. These are not all of the ones under the neurodivergent umbrella, but these are some of the ones under the neurodivergent umbrella. This includes ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, bipolar, epilepsy, autism, tic disorders, highly sensitive people, narcissistic personality disorder, schizophrenia, PTSD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, quite a number of different things. Now, when we're looking under this umbrella, the first question I want to bring is, do you have any experiences with any of these differences? Irene, can I have you pause the recording for a second? So, especially because we have such difficulty knowing what the terms are and what specific differences are and what that means, I thought I wanted to break it down a little bit. Now, autism spectrum is a neurodivergence that many people are very familiar with its existence. They talk about the autism spectrum. The idea of an autism spectrum is a little bit misleading. It suggests that there's one side of a line and another side of a line, and people are all inside that one line if they're autistic people, if they have autism spectrum processing differences. However, what we find is that when talking about something like autism or other cognitive processing differences, they're not really just one uniform thing. The processing differences with autism affect multiple aspects of a person's processing. Autism can come with social differences. So your differences in reading and identifying social situations. It can have differences in your interests, what different things you're interested in, and the amount of attention you put to those interests can be related to autism differences. It can be differences in repetitions, how many times you do things, or how many repetitions you need to do things well can be how your brain processes differently. You can have sensory sensitivities. You may have differences in emotional regulation. You might have differences in perception. You might have differences in the way you executively function and move attention between different things. And there are other differences in that as well. The big idea is there are lots of different ways your brain might be handling information differently in order, and that all may be called autism. What that means is that the work you're doing in that task will look significantly different than a neurotypical person, because you're going to be putting your energy and your effort into different places. Your attention will be focused differently. So let's break that down a little bit. If you're a person with sensory sensitivities, so you have auditory processing sensory differences, that will mean you might be hearing more information than another person will be hearing. So when you're trying to problem solve, you will need to sort out the auditory information that is really useful information in that time and in that space, and the auditory information that's just distraction from your problem solving. So when you're problem solving, when you're working on that problem, you're going to have less attention, less resources going to that problem, because your sensory differences and sensitivities will eat up that processing information, energy. And so the way of a neurodivergent person is processing information will use resources differently and be done in a significantly different way than a neurotypical person. It makes predicting what's going to be supportive for a neurodivergent person really difficult without that person's input, because an outside person may not be able to guess or judge what's happening in a neurodivergent person's head very well at all if they don't have awareness of the differences that person has. Are there any questions or thoughts on this idea? Because it's a building block to the kind of argument of using a cognitive load framework for this. So a cognitive load framework is kind of the place I'm sitting this in and playing with this in. And it's the idea that anytime we try to think or process or do anything, it is work. And we are able to do a certain amount of work at a certain time and balance that work. And that work comes in different parts. That work might be the work necessary for the task. So me being here on this call and identifying the right words to say and choosing the right words and saying the right words might be the intrinsic load of this task of sharing about neurodivergent learning. Now I'm going to have some extraneous processing as well. My extraneous processing is extra work that's unnecessary for the learning. Now, I might have an intrinsic load of hoping I'm providing you the right information that you might need, but I might have extraneous processing of anxiety that I might not be providing you the information that you might need. And both of these are happening in my head at the same time, affecting how well I give you the information that you might need. Now, germane processing is the work that I can put to making sure I'm connecting knowledge and I'm taking what people have said before and supporting it and connecting it with other information, and not just meeting the basic load of the task, but adding the above and beyond processing that makes that learning stick, that makes that learning transfer, that makes that learning connect important ideas together. That's the germane processing. And at any given time, every single learner is balancing the load of the task or the multiple tasks that they're doing, the extraneous information that's processing that happens regardless of whether or not they wanted to, that is just their brain working and that could be taking away from the task, and the germane process of taking the information that's being shared and putting it together in ways that create meaning. And that can be done as an individual alone, that can be done as individuals together, and those tasks will balance differently. But when I'm thinking of processing, when I'm thinking of neurodivergence, when I'm thinking of differences, I find that having a cognitive load framework of thinking as work, and that there are limits to the amount of cognitive load you can do at one time. So you're always trying to balance your cognitive loads at different times to do the work that you need to do to make it through the day. Now, when using this cognitive load framework, the part that's really important to understand is the idea of cognitive overload. The idea that once you hit a point above what the cognitive load can manage and above what can be balanced with that cognitive load, your processing will suffer. There's a point called cognitive overload, and when cognitive overload hits, processing and integration of information stops. And it can be a complete stop and a total breakdown. I tend to think of an autistic meltdown as hitting that cognitive overload and having a full-on breakdown because of the sensory and the information processing requirements are so much that the person cannot stay integrated. They can't keep their body, their emotions, their mind working together in a whole perspective to move them forward. So as an educator, as an instructor, as a person guiding people through information, I like to try to think of keeping cognitive load low enough that it never hits that cutoff line of cognitive overload. And the people are playing and balancing in that cognitive load area where they feel power, and they never hit that point where they lose the ability to integrate information, because that point is painful. That point is hard. That point is stressful. And that point can cause a lot of learning trauma. Now I'm going to stop share. I'm going to ask Irene to pause. And I'm bringing it back to the sharing. And now this is one example of a processing difference. It is a visual example, and I apologize if it is not accessible to everyone. This is a processing difference associated with a difference called aphantasia. Now, for those of us who do have visual processing as an aspect of our worlds, I would like us to close our eyes and try to imagine a red apple. I have a picture of a red apple on the screen, so that might help you see what a red apple would be. But I would like you to close your eyes and try to picture that. Okay. Now that you've done that, here's an image that shows a picture of what that picture of a red apple might look like in your head. So if you are a number 1, you see a real object. You see the apple. You might be able to see its skin. You might be able to see little holes in the skin. You might be able to picture the texture on the leaf of the apple. If you're number 2, it might look like a cartoon red apple, and it might still be red, and it might still have a leaf, but it won't have each pore. You won't be able to see the textures. If you have a 3, it might still be an apple, but it might not be colored. If you have a 4, it might only be an outline of an apple. And if you have a 5, it might be nothing. I am somewhere between a 4 and a 5. In my head, when you say close your eyes and picture an apple, I am not able to draw the picture of the apple. I do not visually image information. I have a difference called aphantasia. What does that mean? Let's think about how that might affect me in a task. If I was doing a task where I had to take a visual image in my head and rotate it to a different direction and imagine how it might fit in a different space with visual rotation, I might not be able to do that task really well because I can't hold that image in my head. It will change the intrinsic load of that task for me. I wanted to use this example because it's so concrete. It's so clear that some people with different numbers would have a different processing than some others. Now, is this difference bad? Is this difference good? In some ways, it will have some values that are positive. In some ways, it will have some values that are negative. One of the most positive aspects of this difference in my life is because I have so much trouble visualizing past events, my memory is actually pretty poor. And if I have negative memories from the past, I don't sit and fixate in my negative memories from the past. I have a lot of trouble bringing them up again in the future because of my difference visualizing. And so it adds some positive because I have less negative memories that are filling my emotional processing in my day-to-day life. And overall, that can bring some very positive things for me. Can we pause the recording again? So now I'm doing a bit of transition. I'm transitioning from, hey, let's think about neurodivergence in terms of how brains are processing information differently, to thinking about neurodivergence in terms of how can you support learners as their brains are processing differently. And these are not an exhaustive list of universal supports. These are just some supports that I believe will make a difference for neurodivergent learners. And each one, I have listed a very short definition of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and then we're going to talk about it as a group, because I wanted to get people exploring these really kind of organically, because they have a lot of, there's a lot of ways they might be affecting learning, and I don't have an exhaustive understanding of it. and they're in no particular order. Invitation to interaction. Neurodivergent learners might need to be invited to interact. They might need to be invited to interact multiple times, and they might need to be invited to interact in multiple ways. If you're a neurodivergent person, if you have processing differences, people's cues and people's social nuance on, hey, you can be a part of this, might be very difficult for you to read. In the United States, there is a neurotypical norm that if you ask someone what they are doing, you are actually asking if you can do that with them. So if your friend and you are sitting down and talking, and your friend says, hey, what are you up to this weekend? Neurotypical people know that that is your friend saying, hey, would you like to do something with me this weekend? Neurodivergent people might not be able to assume that that is what is being said. They might just tell you what they are doing that weekend. One friend wanted to spend time with the other friend. They communicated with that other friend in a way that that other friend did not see the invitation to interact. The friend wanted to interact with the friend, but they did not communicate the invitation to interact in a way that it was accessible. And so both friends missed the opportunity to interact because that invitation to interact was never made apparent in a way that was accessible. Think about in your learning situations, in different ages of learners, how you invite your learners to participate in the learning situation. Think about how often you're inviting the learners to participate. Think about how big your ask is that invites the learners. Is it an easy ask that is very cost-free for the individual? Like give your name or name something you like? Or are they very heavy, weighty, costly invitations like, tell me about a time when you were not successful in learning? The cost of the invitation affects whether people will take you up on that invitation. So having an invitation to interact, making that invitation at multiple times, in multiple places, in multiple ways, will allow neurodivergent learners to take you up on that invitation when they can, in ways they can, in places at times that work for them. So this was the first of my universal supports. Are there questions or comments about it? And Irene, if you could pause. One. So the next universal support I'm going to talk about is chunking support. Chunking is a cognitive load idea in that if we're trying to memorize separate units of information, we are going to be able to hold less pieces of information in our heads than if we put information into groups and hold that information in groups in our head. So if I ask you to list all the foods you can, your list is likely to be shorter than if I ask you to list all of the fruits, vegetables, meats, and dairies, then you can. Because one of those tasks gives you a big field of information that you need to prime as much as you can in that big field. And the other gives you conceptual boxes to hold information and organize it in. Chunking information into bits and pieces and boxes is one of our most important cognitive tasks we're able to do. Learners, when they're new with information, are not as good at breaking down information into different bins to remember it. And when we can support our learners in making and breaking these information down into the different bins that it fits in ways that help them as they go through the task, your learners will have more cognitive processing power to do the other parts of the task. And so they will be more successful at the task overall. If you are introducing very complex tasks to them, learners will have an easier time with complex tasks if you help them break them down at first, and then scaffold the breaking it down for themselves as they get better at that task themselves. So if you help them identify the different pieces and divide factors into the different areas, help them determine which step to do first, the next, this is going to help your learners break information down more powerfully and process that information more powerfully. Okay, I'm going to stop and we're going to pause and we're going to talk about, and that is automation support. So just like we break information into chunks to remember it, and that's a universal for how our brains remember information, and we can use that powerfully to support learning, automation is another universal of cognitive processing that we use to process more powerfully, and teachers can support learners in using more powerfully. So when we automate information, when we practice something again and again until we get good at it, once we get good enough at it, that information will move from conscious processing to unconscious processing, and we will no longer have as heavy an intrinsic load with that process. So for those of us who drive cars in this room, in this meeting, think about when you first started to drive a car, how when you had to look at the mirror and look behind you and feel the car move and think about each turn and how much it moved the car and how heavy of a cognitive load that initial driving process was. After you've driven for a number of years, the thinking to look at the mirror isn't a thought you have to have anymore. It just automatically happens. That thinking of how much you need to turn your body to turn the wheel isn't consciously done anymore. It automatically happens. When we practice things, we can turn them automatic, and that can support doing it with less work and learning it and using that in other learning processes more powerfully for less work. Now, there is one huge caveat I need to put to this, and that is with certain neurodivergences like dyslexia, they find automating means you have to process it more times to do it before it turns automatic. So dyslexic people, I've heard, and I don't know how accurate this number is, but I've heard that dyslexic people need to practice 10 times as many times as non-dyslexic people to automate the same sorts of things. So that doesn't mean that practice won't help these people, but it does mean that the amount of practice to automate certain things might be very different for different learners. And that you will want to have practice in learning situations so that aspects of that learning can be automated and not be done consciously, so that the learners can do that process more easily later. That is one half of automation. The other half of automation is the harms that automation can be. Automation, if you automate things that are wrong, you will continuously do that wrong thing again and again and again and again. Think about where you've automated someone's name incorrectly. Or a modern example, you've automated someone's pronouns, and then they identify that different pronouns are meaningful to them. Think about how hard it is to take that automated pronouns and bring them back into conscious processing. Consciously change them to different pronouns for future use. At times, as an instructor, you will want to take learning that has been automated and bring it back into conscious processing to identify bias in it, to identify errors in it. And this will help your learners take behaviors that have been automated with errors and bring them back into conscious processing so that they can address the errors for future learning and future use. Okay. Irene, do you want to pause there? Record again? So the next I want to talk about is options. In terms of neurodivergent learners and identifying within a room who your neurodivergent learners are, you're never going to be able to identify all of your neurodivergent learners. One, because there's no need for many of them to disclose. That's a privacy thing for many of them. Two, many of your learners might not even know about their neurodivergence, as it may not have been identified in their worlds. What you can do is provide them agency in their own learning by giving them options to choose processes or products that work better for their individual processing. So by providing multiple options for how to do an assignment or multiple outcomes for what the assignment might look for, you're allowing your learners agency in choosing processes and products that work for their minds and their processing. Now, another big part of the idea of making things accessible and reducing barriers for neurodivergent learners is recognizing that a lot of cognitive processing differences are social and emotional in nature. There are cognitive processing differences with anxiety, where you're emotionally processing so much information consciously that you do not have a lot of time or energy to process a lot of problem solving, because all of your resources are going to the social emotional. By including aspects of social emotional processing, by making your learners feel safe, by making your learners feel welcome, by making your learners feel valued, by respecting and honoring your learners' dignity and their agency and valuing their contribution, you can remove and reduce the loads associated with negative social emotional interactions by just planning for kindness and consideration and dignity of your learners in your learning settings. You make your learning more accessible to anyone with social emotional processing differences. And that can be different in reading social emotional. That can be differences in how much you're cognitively processing the social emotional. And that can be differences in how you're receiving the social emotional that you're processing. So all of these social emotional aspects are affecting your learners as they're interacting with your course material. So by intentionally integrating it and intentionally reducing that load by making it positive load, you're actually making your learning more accessible for your learners. Now, this one, having clear expectations, is a really big, important one when it comes to how many of these processing differences relate to communication differences and really impact communication. If you have a learner with social cues differences, or you have a learner with auditory processing differences, or with visual processing differences, these are going to greatly impact what you think you're communicating to your learner and what your learner is walking away from that communication with. Now, what ends up being important? What you think you're communicating or what your learner walks away with? The important aspect is what your learner walks away with. No matter what you think you're giving them, what they learn from the class is actually what they walk away with. And so, by being very clear and very direct with what is meaningful to you, what you want them walking away with, what you're caring about, what you're evaluating, what you're judging by communicating that clearly, by communicating that in multiple ways, by communicating that in writing, it makes it much easier for your neurodivergent learners to meet that expectation. If they understand the expectation, they will have a better chance of meeting it. And so by having it be really clear, by having it be really direct, by having it communicated in multiple ways, it makes it much more accessible. Now, the final one that I'm wanting to talk about that I think I've mentioned multiple times already, is pressing the wrong button, is flexibility. And that is, there's not going to be one right way of balancing and optimizing all of your loads for all of your learners at every moment. The more flexibility you can include in your learning situations, the more you can have differences in outputs, differences in timelines, differences in how people can present and have it be acceptable, the better your learners are going to be at meeting those expectations. So by providing flexibility, it makes it easier for each and every learner to balance their limited resources in ways that give them power in the learning situation and make that learning meaningful to them. Thank you so much for letting me share this information and having such rich conversations about it. I have put a couple of resources here. If people wanted more information, there are a couple of books that I found that are really interesting books that look about ableism and identity and agency with neurodivergence. One is Unmasking Autism The Power of Embracing Our Hidden Neurodiversity by Dr. Devin Price. Another book is We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation by Eric Garcia. Well, both of these are autism-centered. They actually discuss neurodivergence very broadly at different points, and they are really good at bringing that conversation to ableism and identity as well. I also find that the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is a really good place to see conversations, and that Lime Connect is a job board and job community associated with neurodivergence and workforce training that can be really valuable for people. Now, I think we're going to stop the recording and I'm going to go on to questions, but thank you so much for your time and your attention. I've really enjoyed this time together.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to stop the recording, so just in case any people have final thoughts.